The Galactic University of Advanced Xenopsychology sat perched on the rim of a dying star, because apparently nothing said we're intellectually superior, quite like building your campus in the most dramatically impractical location possible. The crystalline spires twisted upward through dimensional folds, their surfaces gleaming with the collected wisdom of 14,000 civilizations, or so the brochures claimed. In reality, most of that wisdom amounted to increasingly elaborate ways to pat each other on the back for being evolved. Professor Velthek's office occupied the highest spire naturally. The ancient Nexari had spent the better part of 3 millennia perfecting the art of academic condescension, and the view from his crystalline desk afforded him the perfect metaphor for looking down on everyone else. His latest victim sat across from him now, a young Etherian whose translucent body flickered with nervous energy patterns that any first-year psychology student could have diagnosed as crippling imposter syndrome masked by intellectual arrogance. Classic graduate student syndrome, really. The Etherian's name was Hexadrin Goldweaver, because apparently even beings of pure crystalline logic weren't immune to pretentious naming convention. Hex, as no one was allowed to call him, had sailed through 6 years of xenopsychological studies with the kind of effortless superiority that made professors either deeply proud or deeply concerned. Today, Professor Velthek was leaning toward the latter. Your dissertation topic, the professor began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had crushed academic dreams for longer than most civilizations had existed, will determine not just your graduation but your entire future in this field. Hex's crystalline form brightened slightly, the Etherian equivalent of sitting up straight. Around them, the office walls displayed floating holographic trophies from various academic conquests, the theoretical pacification of the Krillian hive mind, the successful behavioral modification of the Taurus Prime Collective, the complete cultural assimilation strategy for the gentle folk of Andromeda Sector 7. Each one represented years of careful study, peer review, and the kind of intellectual masturbation that passed for serious scholarship in advanced galactic society. You've excelled in every theoretical framework we've presented. Velthek continued, manipulating a holographic display with tentacles that moved like liquid smoke. Psychological dominance matrices, economic control paradigms, cultural hegemony implementation, all excellent work. The praise should have been gratifying, but something in the professor's tone suggested a however was incoming. Hex had learned to fear academic howevers the way primitive species feared natural disasters. However, there it was. True mastery requires practical application. Theory without real-world testing is merely intellectual decoration. The holographic display shifted, cycling through images of various species. The proud warrior clans of Beta Centauri, their conquest strategies neatly categorized and color-coded. The merchant princes of the Veil Nebula, their economic weaknesses mapped with mathematical precision. The hive minds of the Outer Rim, their collective consciousness patterns reduced to predictable algorithms. Choose your subject, Velthek said, and his tone carried the casual cruelty of someone offering a condemned prisoner their choice of execution method. Hex's crystalline matrix hummed with processing power as he considered the option. Each species represented months of research, careful analysis, and the kind of detailed psychological profiling that would make a surveillance state weep with envy. The smart choice would be something manageable, perhaps the peaceful contemplatives of Rachel Prime, whose entire culture revolved around philosophical meditation and wouldn't fight back if you conquered them with stern looks and disappointed touch. But Hex had not clawed his way to the top of his class by making smart choices. He had done so by making choices that made everyone else look stupid by comparison. What about the humans? He asked. The question hung in the air like a particularly inappropriate joke at a funeral. Professor Velthek's expression shifted through several dimensions of disbelief, before settling on something resembling pity. The humans, the professor repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. You want to write your dissertation on how to control the human. Is there a problem with that? Hex asked, his crystalline form brightening with what he assumed was confidence, but what any competent observer would have recognized as catastrophic naivety. Velthek leaned back in his dimensional chair, which adjusted itself across 17 different planes of existence to accommodate his amusement. The humans. Oh, this was in 3 millennia of academic life, he had seen ambitious students choose impossible topics before, but this was something special, This was like watching someone announce their intention to teach poetry to a supernova. "No problem at all," he said finally, and his smile could have powered a small moon with its sheer predatory energy. "In fact, I think it's exactly what you need." The office's environmental systems hummed with the kind of satisfied purring that suggested even the building was looking forward to the impending academic disaster. Somewhere in the depths of the university's vast database, automated systems began pulling files on humanity, a collection of reports that read less like scientific observation and more like complaint letters from a frustrated cosmos. Hex left the meeting with his crystalline matrix practically glowing with anticipation. Finally, a challenge worthy of his intellect. How hard could it be to figure out how to control a species that had barely figured out interstellar travel? They were mammals, for crying out loud. Mammals with opposable thumbs and delusions of grandeur. As he walked through the university's crystalline corridors, past displays of conquered worlds and subjugated peoples, Hex began mentally organizing his research strategy: standard psychological profiles, historical analysis, behavioral pattern recognition, all the tools that had served him so well in previous studies. By the time he reached his dormitory, he was already drafting his thesis outline. The title practically wrote itself: Primitive Control Mechanisms and Their Application to Late-Stage Pre-Contact Civilizations, a case study in human behavioral management. It would be the easiest dissertation in the history of the university. After all, what could possibly be complicated about understanding a species that fought wars over imaginary lines on maps and got emotionally attached to small furry creatures that served no practical purpose? Hex settled into his research chamber, activated his information matrices, and began downloading every file the galactic database had on human civilization. The loading screen estimated completion in approximately 6 standard hours. It would take considerably longer than that for him to realize he had just volunteered to solve a puzzle that had been quietly driving the galaxy's greatest minds to drink for the better part of 2 centuries. The first warning sign should have been the sheer volume of data. Most species warranted perhaps a few terabytes of behavioral analysis, enough to catalog their social structures, identify their psychological pressure points, and develop a comprehensive control strategy that could fit comfortably in a graduate-level thesis. Humans, apparently, required their own dedicated storage dimension. Hex stared at the download progress bar, which had been stuck at 37% for the past 4 hours. His crystalline matrix flickered with the kind of processing strain usually reserved for calculating hyperdimensional physics, or trying to understand modern art. The university's quantum servers were practically groaning under the weight of human documentation, and that was just the preliminary files. "Curious," he muttered, which in Etherean academic circles was roughly equivalent to screaming in existential terror. The files, once they finally loaded, painted a picture that defied every theoretical framework he had ever studied. Human history read like a case study in spectacular inconsistency, as if the entire species had collectively decided that logical behavioral patterns were for other people. Where the Krillian hive mind showed predictable responses to authority structures, humans displayed what could only be described as weaponized contrariness. Take economic control, for instance. Standard xenopsychological theory dictated that resource scarcity would inevitably lead to social compliance. Starve a population, and they would submit to any authority that promised food. Simple, elegant, and effective across 43 documented species. Humans, naturally, had turned this into an art form of creative defiance. The files contained reports of something called the Irish potato famine, where humans had responded to engineered starvation by leaving, en masse, to other continents, while singing songs about, and then spent the next century holding grudges that apparently transcended both death and rational economic self-interest. But that was just the beginning. The French, according to the historical records, had responded to economic oppression by inventing a device specifically designed to remove the heads of their oppressors, and then proceeded to use it with the kind of industrial efficiency that would have impressed a modern factory. The Americans had turned tax collection into a casus belli, and built an entire civilization around the principle that authority figures should be treated with suspicion. And the less said about the Russians, the better. Hex's translation matrix had difficulty processing some of the more colorful human expressions, But the general sentiment appeared to be that winter, starvation, and impossible odds were merely obstacles that made victory more personally satisfying. Anomalous responses, Hex noted in his research log, though his crystalline form was beginning to dim with what experienced academics would recognize as creeping dread. Military occupation presented an even more bewildering puzzle. The standard approach, overwhelming force followed by systematic psychological demoralization, had proven effective across dozens of worlds. The gentle folk of Andromeda had submitted after a single demonstration of superior firepower. The Taurus Collective had reorganized their entire society around the preferences of their conquerors. Humans had invented something called guerrilla warfare, which seemed to involve hiding in uncomfortable places and making life miserable for anyone trying to maintain order. The files contained detailed accounts of occupied territories where the supposed victors spent more time looking over their shoulders than actually governing, while the defeated population treated resistance as a form of recreational activity. The Vietnamese, according to the records, had somehow convinced a technologically superior enemy to simply leave. After years of fighting, the Afghans had apparently made a hobby of this, with multiple galactic superpowers trying and failing to establish lasting control over terrain that most species would have abandoned as uninhabitable. And then there were the Poles, who had responded to being conquered by maintaining an entire shadow government, complete with educational systems, cultural institutions, and what appeared to be a thriving underground postal service. They had treated occupation as a temporary inconvenience, rather than a permanent change in management. Hex paused his research to recalibrate his analytical matrices. Clearly he was missing something fundamental. No species could be this consistently irrational without some underlying pattern, some exploitable weakness that previous researchers had overlooked. He dove deeper into the psychological profiles, searching for the common threads that would unlock the puzzle of human behavior. Surely their emotional responses would follow predictable patterns. Fear, after all, was a universal constant. Every sentient species had survival instincts that could be manipulated through carefully applied pressure. The results were somehow even more confusing. Humans appeared to have developed an inverse relationship with danger, where increased threat levels correlated with increased stubborn defiance rather than submission. The files contained accounts of individuals who had walked calmly toward certain death rather than compromise their principles, and entire populations who had chosen collective suicide over surrender. The Masada incident alone required 17 different analytical frameworks to even begin to make sense of, and even then Hex suspected he was missing crucial context. Who builds a fortress on top of an isolated mountain and then decides that death is preferable to conquest? What kind of cost-benefit analysis leads to that conclusion? But perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of humans who had endured systematic psychological torture and emerged not broken. The concentration camp survivors who had not only maintained their sanity but actively worked to document their experiences for future generations. The political prisoners who had used solitary confinement as an opportunity for intellectual development. The slaves who had created entire cultural movements around the concept of eventual freedom. It was as if humans had collectively decided that suffering was a form of character development, rather than a deterrent. Hex's research chamber had grown cold, the environmental systems responding to his increasingly agitated energy pattern. Around him, holographic displays showed comparison charts that made no sense, behavioral matrices that defied standard psychological theory, and historical timelines that read like elaborate practical jokes played by the universe itself. He tried consulting his fellow students, hoping that perhaps a fresh perspective might illuminate some crucial detail he had overlooked. The responses ranged from polite confusion to outright mockery. "Oh, the humans," laughed crystalline entitization, 47, whose species had achieved perfect logical harmony through the elimination of individual consciousness. "We did a preliminary study on them during our second year. Fascinating example of evolutionary dead-end psychology." "Dead end?" Hex asked. "Oh yes. Complete inability to adapt to superior civilizations, still using primitive tribal bonding mechanisms, and individual identity preservation. They'll extinct themselves within a few centuries through sheer bloody-mindedness." But the files told a different story. Human population continued to grow. Their technology advanced at an alarming rate,
and their expansion into space showed no signs of the self-limiting behaviors that characterize truly primitive species. If anything, they seemed to treat the vast emptiness of space as merely another inconvenient obstacle to overcome through collective stubbornness. As the weeks passed, Hex's initial confidence began to erode like a sand castle facing an incoming tide. Every theoretical framework he applied to human behavior produced contradictory results. Every historical pattern he identified immediately spawned counterexamples that defied categorization. The humans, it appeared, had not simply failed to develop logical response patterns to external control. They had actively evolved mechanisms to resist it, passing down through generations not just the knowledge of how to fight, but the cultural imperative to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. And perhaps most troubling of all, they seemed to enjoy it. Hex dimmed his crystalline form and prepared to dive deeper into the files. Somewhere in the vast ocean of human documentation, there had to be an answer. There had to be a way to control them. After all, his dissertation depended on it.
The grand amphitheater of academic excellence had been designed by committee, which explained why it looked like a crystal cathedral had collided with a mathematics textbook and then been polished by beings with no concept of restraint. Tiered seating spiraled upward through 17 dimensions, accommodating species whose physical forms ranged from gaseous clouds to sentient geometric equations. The acoustics were perfect, which meant that every nervous gulp, anxious fidget, and quiet sob of academic despair could be heard by every entity in attendance. Today's dissertation presentations had drawn quite the crowd. The academic year's final examinations always attracted spectators eager to witness either brilliant triumph or spectacular failure, and the faculty had learned that both were equally entertaining when you had tenure and nothing better to do. Hex materialized at the presenter's podium with all the confidence of someone who had spent the last 3 months discovering that their chosen topic was roughly equivalent to solving the meaning of existence using only finger paints and interpretive dance. His crystalline form flickered with what observers might charitably call composed determination, but which anyone with functioning pattern recognition would identify as barely contained panic. The first few presentations had gone exactly as expected. Entity dissertation 93 had delivered a flawless analysis of Andromedan hive mind vulnerabilities, complete with flowcharts, probability matrices, and a working demonstration using volunteer subjects. The audience had nodded appreciatively as the volunteers' individual consciousnesses dissolved into blissful collective harmony. Being formerly known as geometric proof had presented an elegant solution to Hegelian philosophical resistance, employing advanced logic cascades to convince an entire civilization that their core beliefs were mathematically inconsistent. The Hegelians had thanked him for the correction and immediately restructured their society around more logically sound principles. Even the notoriously difficult Tau Ceti collective had yielded to Entity Prime's economic warfare simulation, their entire culture reorganizing itself around market-friendly consumption patterns within the span of a single presentation slide. The pattern was clear, predictable, and thoroughly reassuring to everyone present. Superior intellect plus advanced theory equaled inevitable control. The natural order of galactic civilization, where evolved species guided their less developed neighbors toward more efficient forms of existence. And then it was Hex's turn. Distinguished faculty, esteemed colleagues, he began, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with the kind of forced confidence that fooled absolutely no one. Today I present my analysis of humanity and the theoretical frameworks for their management. Professor Velthik leaned forward in his dimensional chair, his ancient features arranged in an expression of polite interest that anyone with survival instincts would have recognized as predatory anticipation. Around the amphitheater, other faculty members settled in with the comfortable satisfaction of apex predators watching a wounded animal stumble into their territory. My initial hypothesis, Hex continued, manipulating holographic displays that showed human population centers, followed standard xenopsychological models, economic pressure, military superiority, psychological conditioning, the fundamental tools that have proven effective across 47 documented species. Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. This was familiar territory, the comfortable certainty of established academic orthodoxy. However, Hex said, and the single word seemed to suck all warmth from the amphitheater, initial analysis revealed complications. The first hologram showed economic control scenarios, standard resource restriction models overlaid with human historical response. The results looked like abstract art, created by someone having an existential breakdown. Economic pressure produces mass migration rather than compliance. Hex explained, his crystalline form dimming slightly. Artificial scarcity generates innovation rather than submission. Market manipulation results in alternative economic systems that actively reject galactic standards. A few nervous chuckles echoed through the audience. Surely this was leading towards some clever solution, some breakthrough insight that would demonstrate human weakness. The second hologram appeared. Military occupation scenarios, showing force projection models and their expected outcomes versus actual human responses. Complete military domination results in cultural preservation through underground networks and generational resistance movements. The chuckling had stopped. The amphitheater was developing the kind of silence that suggested either profound contemplation or growing horror. Psychological conditioning, Hex continued, summoning the third hologram, produces equally anomalous results. Systematic demoralization generates spite-based motivation. Identity suppression results in cultural crystallization. Isolation creates philosophical development. Even torture appears to function as character building. Professor Velthek's expression had shifted from predatory amusement to something resembling concern. Around the amphitheater, faculty members were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their various forms of seat. My initial assumption, Hex pressed on, his voice gaining strength as academic terror transformed into something approaching intellectual honesty, was that these responses indicated some flaw in my methodology. Surely no species could be so consistently irrational without some underlying exploitable pattern. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch until it became almost tangible. I was wrong. The fourth hologram materialized, not a chart or graph, but a three-dimensional map of human expansion patterns, cultural transmission networks, and what could only be described as civilization-scale stubbornness visualization. Humans are not failing to respond to control mechanisms, Hex announced, his crystalline form now blazing with the kind of intensity that accompanied either breakthrough discovery or complete mental breakdown. They have evolved specifically to resist them. The silence in the amphitheater had achieved a quality that transcended mere absence of sound and entered the realm of existential dread. Individual variation prevents universal psychological manipulation. Cultural memory preserves resistance techniques across generations. Technological adaptation ensures that superior force becomes temporary advantage rather than permanent solution. And most critically, he paused, savoring the moment of academic revolution. They appear to derive positive emotional reinforcement from the act of resistance itself. Entity diseducation. 47 raised what might charitably be called a hand. Surely you're not suggesting that an entire species has evolved to be uncontrollable. I am suggesting, Hex replied, his voice carrying across 17 dimensions of suddenly very quiet academic space, that humanity represents the galaxy's first documented example of a species that has weaponized uncontrollability as an evolutionary survival strategy. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If humans couldn't be controlled through standard mechanisms, if they had actually evolved to resist control, then what did that mean for galactic civilization? For the careful hierarchies that kept advanced species in charge of less advanced ones, for the entire theoretical framework that justified, well, everything. Professor Velthek stood slowly, his ancient form unfolding through several spatial dimensions. And your proposed solution? Hex's crystalline matrix flickered once, twice, and then stabilized in a pattern that observers would later describe as either profound wisdom or complete surrender to cosmic absurdity. Don't, he said simply. The word echoed through the amphitheater, like a funeral bell tolling for the death of academic certainty. Don't attempt to control humans, don't engage in economic warfare with them, don't try to occupy their territory, or suppress their culture or condition their response, because every attempt to control them makes them stronger, more adaptable, and considerably more annoying to deal with. He manipulated the holographic display one final time, showing a simple graph. On one axis, attempts to control humans. On the other axis, human technological advancement, territorial expansion, and what appeared to be their collective capacity for creative spite.
The correlation was undeniable. In conclusion, Heck said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had stared into the academic abyss and found it staring back, the question, how do you control humanity, has a simple answer. Because they have spent their entire evolutionary history becoming impossible to control, and they're really, really good at it. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a conversation killer to socially awkward species across the galaxy. Somewhere in the back of the amphitheater, a junior professor fainted. The sound of their crystalline form hitting the dimensional flooring rang out like a tiny bell announcing the end of an era. The immediate aftermath of Hex's presentation resembled nothing so much as a philosophical bomb going off in a library. Faculty members sat in various states of crystalline shock, their advanced cognitive matrices struggling to process information that fundamentally contradicted everything they had spent centuries believing about the natural order of galactic civilization. Professor Valthek was the first to recover, though recover might have been overstating the case. His ancient form had taken on the consistency of philosophical jelly, rippling through dimensions, as his mind grappled with implications that threatened to unravel 3 millennia of academic certainty. This is absolutely preposterous. But even as he said it, the conviction was already draining from his voice like air from a punctured habitat dome. Because the evidence was undeniable, the logic was sound, and somewhere in the deepest recesses of his academic consciousness, he was beginning to remember certain incidents that suddenly made terrible sense. Like the time the Galactic Trade Consortium had tried to establish favorable trading relationships with human colonies, only to discover that humans had responded by creating their own competing trade network that somehow undercut galactic prices, while simultaneously offering better service, and what they inexplicably called customer satisfaction guarantees. Or the incident with the peaceful hegemony of Andromeda, whose attempt to establish a cultural guidance center on a human world had resulted in the humans politely thanking them for the suggestions, and then proceeding to do exactly the opposite, while maintaining perfectly diplomatic relations, and somehow making the hegemony look unreasonable. Objecting. The more Professor Valthek thought about it, the more he realized that the galaxy's relationship with humanity had always been, not because humans were primitive or weak, but because every attempt to treat them as primitive or weak had resulted in outcomes that suggested they were neither. Around the amphitheater, similar realizations were dawning on other faculty members. Entity Prime was frantically reviewing his economic warfare models, discovering that every theoretical human vulnerability he had identified corresponded to documented human innovations that had revolutionized entire industry. Being formerly known as geometric proof, was running recursive logic checks on his philosophical domination frameworks, only to find that humans had somehow anticipated every major argument and developed counter-philosophies that were not only internally consistent, but surprisingly compelling. The academic panic was spreading with the kind of exponential growth typically associated with plague vectors, or really effective gossip networks. But the real crisis began when news of Hex's presentation leaked beyond the university's crystalline wall. Academic institutions across the galaxy operated on the principle that information, like energy, could neither be created nor destroyed, only transferred from one pompous institution to another. Within hours, emergency faculty meetings were convening on dozens of worlds, as the implications of the human problem rippled outward through the galaxy's intellectual infrastructure. The University of Cosmic Certainty, on Rigel Prime, immediately convened a crisis committee to investigate whether their own human studies might have missed something critical. The Advanced Institute for Species Management in the Tau Ceti system began frantically reviewing their theoretical frameworks for signs of human-shaped holes in their logic. Even the notoriously arrogant Academy of Superior Beings in the Andromeda Galaxy found themselves asking uncomfortable questions about the fundamental assumptions underlying their entire curriculum. Because if humans couldn't be controlled, if they had actually evolved to resist control, then what did that say about all the other species that supposedly could be controlled? Were those species actually controllable, or had they simply never developed effective resistance mechanisms? And more troubling still, were the galaxy's advanced civilizations actually advanced, or just lucky enough to have encountered primarily cooperative neighbors. The philosophical implications were staggering, but the practical implications were worse. Galactic civilization had been built on carefully maintained hierarchies, with older, more evolved species providing guidance to younger, less developed ones. The entire system depended on the assumption that superior technology and advanced psychology could overcome primitive stubbornness and cultural inertia. If humans had proven that assumption wrong, then what was to stop other species from developing similar resistance mechanisms? What happened when the gentle folk of Andromeda decided they didn't want to be gentle anymore? What if the peaceful contemplatives of Rigel Prime concluded that contemplation was overrated and direct action was more satisfying? Hex, meanwhile, found himself in the peculiar position of having accidentally become the galaxy's leading expert on a problem that no one had previously acknowledged existed. His dissertation defense had turned into an impromptu lecture series, as faculty members from across the university demanded explanations for human behaviors that had previously been dismissed as incomprehensible primitivity. But surely, insisted Wavelength Harmonizer, from the Department of Cultural Assimilation, there must be some mechanism for managing their expansion.
Some way to channel their energies in more productive directions. Hexy's crystalline form had stabilized into what could only be described as weary resignation. Every attempt to channel human energies has resulted in those energies finding new and unexpected outlets, suppress their territorial expansion, and they develop spacefaring technology centuries ahead of schedule, limit their cultural expression, and they create art forms that somehow become galactically influential, try to control their technological development, and they innovate solutions that make your control mechanisms obsolete. But that's impossible, protested Entity Designation. No species can be completely resistant to external management. That, Hex replied, is exactly what makes them so terrifying. The weeks following the presentation saw a cascade of revelations as researchers across the galaxy began examining their own interactions with humanity through this new theoretical lens. Trade negotiations that had been dismissed as humans being unreasonably difficult were revealed as systematic resistance to economic dominance. Diplomatic incidents attributed to human cultural primitivity proved to be sophisticated defenses against political manipulation. Even seemingly innocent cultural exchanges showed evidence of humans carefully maintaining their independence while appearing to cooperate. The Galactic Council's Department of Species Integration quietly reclassified humanity from developing civilization standard management protocols to civilization of uncertain parameters approach with extreme caution. The change in classification was buried in bureaucratic paperwork, but word spread quickly through diplomatic channels. Humanity had officially become the galaxy's first recognized uncontrollable species. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from the Historical Analysis Division, whose deep-time researchers began investigating whether other species had ever developed similar resistance mechanisms. The results painted a picture that no one had wanted to acknowledge. Every truly successful galactic civilization had, at some point in its development, gone through a phase of being impossible to control. The implications were clear. Humanity wasn't an anomaly or an evolutionary dead end. They were an example of what successful species development actually looked like, which meant that all the galaxy's primitive species weren't failing to evolve. They were evolving exactly as they should, toward independence, self-determination, and the kind of weaponized stubbornness that made external control impossible. Hexy's final thesis presentation, delivered 6 months later to a packed amphitheater that included representatives from 14 different galactic governments, 3 trade federations, and what appeared to be a collective consciousness that had manifested specifically to hear the lecture, contained a single slide. The question, "How do you control humanity?" contains a false assumption. The correct question is, how do you coexist with a species that has evolved beyond the need for external control? The answer, he suggested, was both simple and revolutionary. You treated them as equals. The concept was so radical that several faculty members required immediate medical attention. But as Hex looked out over the audience of advanced beings who had spent millennia believing in their own superiority, he couldn't help but notice that many of them were taking notes. Frantic, desperate notes.
as if their entire worldview was crumbling, and they were trying to sketch out blueprints for whatever came next. Because if humanity had taught the galaxy anything, it was that evolution never stopped. Resistance was always possible, and the universe had a deeply ironic sense of humor about who got to be in charge. The final exam had asked how to control humanity, and the room had remained silent because there was no answer. But perhaps Hex thought as he watched galactic civilization quietly panic about its fundamental assumptions, that had been the point all along.